of Maccabees. Today we are going to be reading chapter 6 through chapter 10. Shortly afterwards, the king sent Gerontis, the Athenian, to force the Jews to violate their ancestral customs and to live no longer by the laws of God, and to profane the temple in Jerusalem and dedicate it to the Olympian Zeus, and the one on Mount Gerizim to Zeus, patron of strangers, as the inhabitants of the latter place had requested. The advent of these evils was painfully hard for all the people to bear. The temple was filled with reveling and debauchery by the Gentiles, who took their pleasure with prostitutes and had intercourse with women in the sacred precincts, introducing other indecencies besides. The altar of sacrifice was loaded with victims prescribed by the law as profane. No one might either keep the Sabbath or observe the traditional feast, or so much as admit to being a Jew. People were driven by harsh compulsion to take part in the monthly ritual meal commemorating the king's birthday, and when a feast of Dionysus occurred, they were forced to wear ivory wreaths and walk in the Dionysiac procession. I'm not pronouncing these words correctly. It looks like Dionysiac procession. A decree was issued at the instance of the people of Ptolemais for the neighboring Greek cities, enforcing the same conduct on the Jews there, obliging them to share in the sacrificial meals, and ordering the execution of those who would not voluntarily conform to Greek customs. So it became clear that disaster was imminent. For example, 2 women were charged with having circumcised their children. They were paraded publicly round the town with their babies hung at their breast, and then hurled over the city wall. Other people who had assembled in some nearby caves to keep the 7th day without attracting attention were denounced to Philip, and were then all burnt to death together, since their consciences would not allow them to defend themselves, out of respect for the holiness of the day. Now I urge anyone who may read this book not to be dismayed at these calamities, but to reflect that such visitations are intended not to destroy our race, but to discipline it. Indeed, when evildoers are not left for long to their own devices, but incur swift retribution, it is a sign of great benevolence. In the case of other nations, the Master waits patiently for them to attain the full measure of their sins before he punishes them. But with us, he has decided to deal differently, rather than to have to punish us later, when our sins come to full measure. And so he never entirely withdraws his mercy from us. He may discipline us by some disaster, but he does not desert his own people. Let this be said simply by way of reminder. We must return to our story without more ado. Eleazar, one of the foremost teachers of the law, a man already advanced in years and of most noble appearance, had his mouth forced open to make him eat a piece of pork. But he, resolving to die with honor rather than to live disgraced, walked out his own accord to the torture of the wheel, having spat the stuff out, as befits those with the courage to reject what is not lawful to taste, rather than live. The people supervising the ritual meal, forbidden by the law, because of the length of time for which they had known him, took him aside and privately urged him to have meat brought of a kind he could properly use, prepared by himself, and only pretend to eat the portions of sacrificial meat as prescribed by the king. This action would enable him to escape death. by availing himself of an act of kindness prompted by their long friendship, but having taken a noble decision worthy of his years, and the dignity of his great age, and the well-earned distinction of his gray hairs, worthy, too, of his impeccable conduct from boyhood, and above all of the holy legislation established by God himself, he answered accordingly, telling them to send him at once to Hades. Pretense, he said, does not befit our time of life. Many young people would suppose that Eleazar at the age of 90 had conformed to the foreigner's way of life, and because I had played this part for the sake of a paltry, brief spell of life, might themselves be led astray on my account. I should only bring defilement and disgrace on my old age. Even though for the moment I avoid execution by man, I can never, living or dead, elude the grasp of the Almighty. Therefore, if I am a man enough to quit this life here and now, I shall prove myself worthy of my old age, and I shall have left the young a noble example of how to make a good death eagerly and generously. For the venerable and holy laws. So saying, he walked straight to the wheel, while those who were escorting him, recently so well disposed towards him, turned against him after this declaration, which they regarded as sheer madness. He, for his part, just before he died, under the blows, gave a sigh and said, "The Lord, whose knowledge is holy, sees clearly that though I might have escaped death, from all of him I gladly endure these agonies of body under the lash, and that in my soul I am glad to suffer." This was how he died, leaving his death as an example of nobility and a record of virtue, not only for the young, but for the greater part of the nation. Chapter 7, the Martyrdom of the 7 brothers. It also happened that 7 brothers were arrested with their mother. The king tried to force them to taste some pork, which the law forbids, by torturing them with whips and scourges. One of them, acting as spokesman for the others, said, "What are you trying to find out from us? We are prepared to die rather than break the laws of our ancestors." The king, in a fury, ordered pans and cauldrons to be heated over a fire. As soon as these were red hot, he commanded that their spokesman should have his tongue cut out, his head scalped, and his extremities cut off, while the other brothers and mother looked on. When he had been rendered completely helpless, the king gave orders for him to be brought, still breathing, to the fire and fried alive in a pan. As the smoke from the pan drifted about, his mother and the rest encouraged one another to die nobly, with such words as these: "The Lord God is watching, and certainly feels sorry for us," as Moses declared in his song, which clearly states that he will take pity on his servants. When the first had left the world in this way, they brought the second forward to be tortured. After stripping the skin from his head, hair, and all, they asked him, "Will you eat some pork before your body is tortured limb by limb?" Replying in his ancestral tongue, he said, "No." So he too was put to the torture in his turn. With his last breath he exclaimed, "Cruel brute, you may discharge us from this present life, but the King of the world will raise us up, since we die for his laws, to live again forever." After him they tortured the third, who on being asked for his tongue promptly thrust it out and boldly held out his hand. hands courageously, saying, Heaven gave me these limbs. For the sake of his laws, I have no concern for them. From him I hope to receive them again. The king and his attendants were astounded at the young man's courage and his utter indifference to suffering. When this one was dead, they subjected the fourth to the same torments and tortures. When he neared his end, he cried, Ours is the better choice, to meet death at men's hands, yet relying on God's promise that we shall be raised up by him, whereas for you there can be no resurrection to new life. Next they brought forward the fifth and began torturing him. But he looked at the king and said, You have power over human beings, mortal as you are, and can act as you please. But do not think that our race has been deserted by God. Only wait, and you will see in your turn how his mighty power will torment you and your descendants. After him they led out the sixth, and his dying words were these, Do not delude yourselves. We are suffering like this through our own fault, having sinned against our own God. Hence, appalling things have befallen us. But do not think you yourself will go unpunished for attempting to make war on God. But the mother was especially admirable and worthy of honorable remembrance, for she watched the death of 7 sons in course of a single day, and bravely endured it because of her hopes in the Lord. Indeed, she encouraged each of them in their ancestral tongue. Filled with noble conviction, she reinforced her womanly argument with many and manly courage, saying to them, I do not know how you appeared in my womb. It was not I who endowed you with the breath and life. I had not the shaping of your every part, and hence the Creator of the world, who made every one and ordained the origin of all things, will in his mercy give you back breath and life, since for the sake of his laws you have no concern for yourselves. Anticus thought he was being ridiculed, suspecting insult in the tone of her voice, and as the youngest was still alive, he appealed to him, not with mere words, but with promises on oath to make him both rich and happy if he would abandon the traditions of his ancestors. He would make him his friend and entrust him with public office. The young man took no notice at all, and so the king then appealed to the mother, urging her to advise the youth to save his life. After a great deal of urging on his part, she agreed to try persuasion on her son. Bending over him, she fooled the cruel tyrant with these words uttered in their ancestral tongue. My son, have pity on me. I carried you 9 months in my womb, and suckled you 3 years, fed you and reared you to the age you are now, and provided for you. I implore you, my child, look at the earth and sky and everything in them, and consider how God made them out of what did not exist, and that human beings come into being in the same way. Do not fear this executioner, but prove yourself worthy of your brothers and accept death, so that I may receive you back with them in the day of mercy. She had hardly finished when the young man said, What are you all waiting for? I will not comply with the king's ordinance. I obey the ordinance of the law given to our ancestors through Moses. As for you, who have contrived every kind of evil against the Hebrews, you will certainly not escape the hands of God. We are suffering for our own sins, and if, to punish and discipline us, our living Lord is briefly angry with us, he will be reconciled with us in due course. But you, unholy, wretch, and wickedest of villains, what causes have you for pride, nourishing vain hopes, and raising your hand against his servants? For you have not yet escaped the judgment of God, the Almighty, the All-Seeing. Our brothers, having endured brief pain for the sake of ever-flowing life, have died for the covenant of God, while you, by God's judgment, will have to pay the just penalty for your arrogance. I too, like my brothers, surrender my body and life for the laws of my ancestors, begging God quickly to take pity on our nation, and by trials and afflictions to bring you to confess that he alone is God, so that with my brothers and myself there may be an end to the wrath of the Almighty, rightly let loose on our whole nation. The king fell into a rage and treated this one more cruelly than the others, for he was himself smarting from the young man's scorn. And so the last brother met his end undefiled and with perfect trust in the Lord. The mother was the last to die after her sons. But let this be sufficient account of the ritual meals and monstrous tortures. Chapter 8. And this segment right here is the victory of Judaism. Judas Maccabeus and the resistance. Judas, otherwise known as Maccabees or Maccabeus, and his companions made their way secretly among the villages, rallying their fellow countrymen. They recruited those who remained loyal to Judaism and assembled about 6,000. They called on the Lord to have regard for the people oppressed on all sides, to take pity on the temple profaned by the godless, to have mercy on the city now being destroyed and leveled to the ground, to hear the blood of the victims that cried aloud to him, to remember too the criminal slaughter of innocent babies, and to avenge their blasphemies perpetrated against his name. As soon as Maccabeus had an organized force, he at once proved invincible to the foreigners, the Lord's anger having turned into compassion. Making surprise attacks on towns and villages, he fired them. He captured favorable positions and inflicted very heavy losses on the enemy, generally availing himself of the cover of night for such enterprises. The fame of his valor spread far and wide. When Philip saw Judas was making steady progress and winning more and more frequent successes, he wrote to Ptolemy, the general officer commanding Chaol, Syria, and Phoenicia, asking for reinforcements in the royal interest. Ptolemy chose Nicanor, son of Patroclus, one of the king's first friends, and sent him without delay at the head of an international force of at least 20,000 men to exterminate the entire Jewish race. As his associate, he appointed Gorgias, a professional general of wide military experience. Nicanor, for his part, proposed, by the sale of Jewish prisoners of war, to raise the 2,000 talents of tribute money owed by the king to the Romans. He lost no time in sending the seaboard towns an invitation to come and buy Jewish manpower, promising delivery of 90 head for 1 talent. But he did not reckon on the judgment from the Almighty that was soon to overtake him. When news reached Judas of Nicanor's advance, he warned his men of the enemy's approach, whereupon the cowardly ones and those who lacked confidence in the justice of God took to their heels and ran away. The rest sold all their remaining possessions, at the same time praying the Lord to deliver them from the godless Nicanor, who had sold them even in advance of an encounter, if not for their own sakes, then at least out of consideration for the covenants made with their ancestors, and because they themselves bore his sacred and majestic name. Maccabees marshaled his men, who numbered about 6,000, and exhorted them not to be dismayed at the enemy or discouraged at the vast horde of Gentiles wickedly advancing against them, but to fight bravely, keeping before their eyes the outrage committed by them against the holy place and the infamous and scornful treatment inflicted on the city, not to mention the destruction of their traditional way of life. They may put their trust in their weapons and their exploits, he said, but our confidence is in Almighty God, who is able with a single nod to overthrow both those marching on us and the whole world with them. He reminded them of the occasions on which their ancestors had received help. That time when, under Sennacherib, 185,000 men had perished. That time in Babylonia, when in the battle with the Galatians, the Jewish combatants numbered only 8,000, with 4,000 Macedonians. Yet when the Macedonians were hard pressed, the 8,000 had destroyed 120,000, thanks to the help they had received from heaven, and had taken great booty as a result, having so roused their courage by these words that they were ready to die for the laws and their country. He then divided his army into 4, putting his brothers, Simon, Joseph, and Jonathan, in command of 1 division each, and assigning them 1,500 men apiece. Next he ordered Esdras to read the holy book aloud, and gave them their watchword, help from God. Then, putting himself at the head of the 1st division, he attacked Nicanor. With the Almighty for their ally, they slaughtered over 9,000 of the enemy, wounded and crippled the greater part of Nicanor's army, and put them all to flight. The money of their prospective purchasers fell into their hands. After pursuing them for a good while, they turned back. Since time was pressing, it was the eve of the Sabbath, and for that reason they did not prolong their pursuit. They collected the enemy's weapons and stripped them of their spoils, and because of the Sabbath, even more heartily blessed and praised the Lord, who had saved them, and who had chosen that day for the first manifestation of his compassion. When the Sabbath was over, they distributed some of the booty among the victims of the persecution and the widows and orphans. The rest they divided among themselves and their children. They then joined in public supplication, imploring the merciful Lord to be fully reconciled with his servants. They also challenged the forces of Timotheus and Bacchides and destroyed over 20,000 of them, gaining possession of several high fortresses. They divided their enormous booty into two equal shares, one for themselves and other for the victims of the persecution, and the orphans and widows, not forgetting the aged. They carefully collected the enemy's weapons and stored them in suitable places. The rest of the spoils they took to Jerusalem. They killed the tribal chieftain on Timotheus' staff, an extremely wicked man who had done great harm to the Jews. In the course of their victory celebrations in Jerusalem, they burned the men who had fired the holy gates. With Chaldeans, they had taken refuge in one small house, so these received a fitting reward for their sacrilege. The triple-dyed scoundrel Nicanor, who had brought the 1,000 merchants to buy the Jews, finding himself with the Lord's help humbled by men he had himself reckoned as of very little account, stripped off his robe of state, and made his way across country unaccompanied, like a runaway slave, reaching Antioch by a singular stroke of fortune, since his army had been destroyed. Thus the man who had promised the Romans to make good their tribute money by selling the prisoners from Jerusalem bore witness that the Jews had a defender, and that they were in consequence invulnerable, since they followed the laws which that defender had ordained. Chapter 9. The last days of Anticus Epiphanes. Oh, here I am again. Brother John said this word the other night. Epiphanes. I'm not doing this very good justice. Anticus Epiphanes. I'm still not saying it right, but you know who I'm talking about. At the same time, Anticus was beating a disorderly retreat from Persia. He had entered the city called Persepolis, planning to rob the temple and occupy the city. But the population at once sprang to arms to defend themselves, with the result that Anticus was routed by the inhabitants and forced to beat a humiliating retreat. On his arrival at Ecbatana, he learned what had happened to Nicanor and to Timotheus' forces. Flying into a passion, he resolved to make the Jews pay for the disgrace inflicted by those who had routed him. And with this in mind, he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping and get the journey over. But the Senate of heaven was already hanging over him. In his pride, he had said, "When I reach Jerusalem, I shall turn it into a mass grave for the Jews." But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and unseen complaint. The words were hardly out of his mouth when he was seized with an incurable pain in his bowels and with excruciating internal torture. And this was only right, since he had inflicted many barbaric tortures on the bowels of others. Even so, he in no way diminished his arrogance, still bursting with pride. Breathing fire in his wrath against the Jews, he was in the act of ordering an an even keener pace when the chariot gave a sudden lurch, and out he fell, and in this serious fall was dragged along, every joint of his body wrenched out of place. He, who only a little while before had thought in his superhuman boastfulness he could command the waves of the sea, he who had imagined he could weigh mountain peaks in a balance, found himself flat on the ground, and then being carried in a litter, a visible demonstration to all of the power of God, in that the very eyes of this godless man teemed with worms, and his flesh rotted away while he lingered on in agonizing pain. And the stench of his decay sickened the whole army. A short while before, he had thought to grasp the stars of heaven. Now no one could bring himself to act as his bearer, for the stench was intolerable. Then and there, as a consequence, in his shattered state, he begins to shed his excessive pride and come to his senses under the divine lash, spasms of pain overtaking him. His stench being unbearable even to himself, he exclaimed, "It is right to submit to God. No mortal should aspire to equality with the Godhead." The wretch began to pray to the Master, who would never take pity on him now, declaring that the holy city towards which he had been speeding to race it to the ground and turn it into a mass grave should be declared free. As for the Jews, whom he had considered as not even worth burying, so much carrion to be thrown out with their children for birds and beasts to prey on, he would give them all equal rights with the Athenians. The holy temple which he had once plundered, he would now adorn with the finest offerings. He would restore all the sacred vessels many times over. He would defray from his personal revenue the expenses incurred for the sacrifices. And to crown all, he would himself turn Jew and visit every inhabited place, proclaiming the power of God. Finding no respite at all from his suffering, God's just sentence having overtaken him, he abandoned all hope for himself, and wrote the Jews the letter transcribed below, which takes the form of an appeal in these terms: To the excellent Jews, to the citizens, Anticus, king and commander-in-chief, sends hearty greetings, wishing them all health and prosperity. If you and your children are well and your affairs as you would wish, we are profoundly thankful. For my part, I cherish affectionate memories of you. On my return from the country of Persia, I fell seriously ill and thought it necessary to make provision for the common security of all. Now that I despair of my condition, for I have great hope of shaking off the malady, but considering how my father, whenever he was making an expedition into the uplands, would designate his successor, so that in case of any unforeseen event or disquieting rumor, the people of the provinces might know to whom he had left the conduct of affairs, and thus remain undisturbed. Furthermore, being well aware that the sovereigners on our frontiers and the neighbors of our realm are watching for opportunities and waiting to see what will happen I have designated as king my son Anticus, whom I have more than once entrusted and commanded to most of you when I was setting out for the upland satrapies. A transcript of my letter to him is appended hereto. I therefore urge and require you, being mindful of the benefits, both public and personal, received from me, that you each persist in those sentiments of goodwill that you harbor towards me. I am confident that he will pursue my own policy with benevolence and humanity, and will prove accommodating to your interest. And so this murderer and blasphemer, having endured sufferings as terrible as those which he had made others endure, met his pitiable fate, and ended his life in the mountains far from his home. His comrade Philip brought back his body, and then, fearing Anticus' son, withdrew to Egypt, to the court of Ptolemy Philometor. Chapter 10. The Purification of the Temple. Maccabees and his companions, under the Lord's guidance, restored the temple and the city, and pulled down the altars erected by the foreigners in the marketplace, as well as the shrines. They purified the sanctuary and built another altar, then striking fire from flints, and using this fire they offered the first sacrifice for 2 years, burning incense, lighting the lamps, and setting out the loaves. When they had done this, prostrating themselves on the ground, they implored the Lord never again to let them fall into such adversity. But if they should ever sin, to correct them with moderation, and not to deliver them over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. This day of the purification of the temple fell on the very day on which the temple had been profaned by the foreigners, the 25th of the same month, Chislev. They kept 8 festival days with rejoicing, in the manner of the Feast of Shelters, remembering how not long before, at the time of the Feast of Shelters, they had been living in the mountains and caverns like wild beasts. Then carrying thyrsus, leafy boughs, and palms, they offered hymns to him who had brought the cleansing of his own holy place to a happy outcome. They also decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole Jewish nation should celebrate those same days every year. The struggle of Judas against the neighboring peoples and against Lysias, minister of Anticus the fifth. Reign of Anticus the fifth. These are the early years. Such were the circumstances attending the death of Anticus, styled Epiphanes. Our task now is to unfold the history of Anticus Eupator, son of that godless man, and briefly to relate the evil effects of the wars. On coming to the throne, this prince put at the head of affairs a certain Lysias, the general officer commanding Coal, Syria, and Phoenicia, whereas Ptolemy, known as Macron, and the first person to govern the Jews justly, had done his best to govern them peacefully, to make up for the wrongs inflicted on them in the past, denounced in consequence to Eupator by the friends of the king, he heard himself called traitor at every turn for having abandoned Cyprus, which had been entrusted to him by Philometor, for having gone over to Anticus Epiphanes, and for having shed no luster on his illustrious office. He committed suicide by poisoning himself. Gorgias now became general of the area. He maintained a force of mercenaries and a continual state of war with the Jews. At the same time, the Idumeans, who controlled important fortresses, were harassing the Jews, welcoming outlaws from Jerusalem, and endeavoring to maintain a state of war. Maccabees and his men, after making public supplications to God, entreating him to support them, began operations against the Idumean fortresses, vigorously pressing home their attack. They seized poison of these vantage points, beating off all who fought on the ramparts. They slaughtered all who fell into their hands, accounting for no fewer than 20,000. 9,000 at least took refuge in two exceptionally strong towers, with everything they needed to withstand a siege, whereupon Maccabees left Simon and Joseph with Zacchaeus and his forces in sufficient numbers to besiege them, and himself went off to other places requiring his attention. But Simon's men were greedy for money and allowed themselves to be bribed by some of the men in the towers, accepting 70,000 drachmas. They let a number of them escape. When Maccabees was told what had happened, he summoned the people's commanders and accused the offenders of having sold their brothers for money by releasing their enemies to fight them. Having executed them as traitors, he at once proceeded to capture both towers, successful in all that he undertook by force of arms. In these two fortresses he slaughtered more than 20,000 men. Timotheus, who had been beaten by the Jews once before, now assembled an enormous force of mercenaries, mustering cavalry from Asia in considerable numbers, and soon appeared in Judea, expecting to conquer it by force of arms. At his approach, Maccabees and his men made their supplications to God, sprinkling earth on their heads and putting sackcloth round their waist, prostrating themselves on the terrace before the altar. They begged him to support them and to show himself the enemy of their enemies, the adversary of their adversaries, as the law clearly states. After these prayers, they armed themselves and advanced a fair distance from the city, halting when they were close to the enemy. As the first light of dawn began to spread, the two sides joined battle, the one having as their pledge of success and victory not only their own valor but their recourse to the Lord, and the other making their own ardor their mainstay in the fight. When the battle was at its height, the enemy saw 5 magnificent men appear from heaven on horses with golden bridles and put themselves at the head of the Jews, surrounding Maccabees and screening him with their own armor. They kept him unscathed, while they rained arrows and thunderbolts on the enemy until, blinded and confused, they scattered in complete disorder. 20,500 infantry and 600 cavalry were slaughtered. Timotheus himself fled to a strongly guarded citadel called Gezer, where Chareas was in command. For 4 days Maccabees and his men eagerly besieged the fortress, while the defenders, confident in the security of the place, hurled fearful blasphemies and godless insults at them. At daybreak on the 5th day, 20 young men of Maccabees' forces, fired with indignation at the blasphemies, manfully assaulted the wall with wild courage, cutting down everyone they encountered. Others, in a similar scaling operation, took the defenders in the rear and set fire to the towers, lighting pyres on which they burned the blasphemers alive. The first, meanwhile, breaking open the gates, let the rest of the army in, and at their head captured the town. Timotheus had hidden in a storage well, but they killed him with his brother Chareas and Apollothenes. When all this was over, with hymns and thanksgiving, they blessed the Lord, who had shown such great kindness to Israel and given them the victory. We will read the rest, which is chapters 11 through, I believe, it's 11 through 15. So if you are listening during the live time, you may be aware that I am going to take a brief, less than 5-minute intermission here, but I'll come back on with the next reading.